If you're watching this video, then you are aware that about 8 months after the RX 7900 GRE launched, AMD updated the drivers, allowing users to overclock the VRAM on the 7900 GRE, which some tech reviewers reported netted them performance improvements upward of 10%. According to them, this was especially pronounced at higher resolutions, like 4K. This news was especially interesting to me as I test GPUs in VR, and typically I'm running games at resolutions higher than 4K. I know this video is super late to the party. I planned on making it months ago, but for those that follow the channel, you know how life got in the way of that plan. I am also fully aware that interest has moved on from the 7900 GRE to Nvidia's 5000 series and AMD's current 9070 GPUs. But as you probably know, those are pretty much unobtainium right now, well, at least here in the US. And due to me still being curious to find out if overclocking my 7900 GRE will make a difference or not, here we are. Now, I should preface this video by saying I am in no way an expert overclocker. I have tinkered with it from time to time, but I typically just run my PC hardware at stock settings, as my past experience with overclocking has been pretty underwhelming, to say the least. You often spend hours and hours doing trial and error tinkering just to get an extra 5 to maybe 10 FPS. I know some people thoroughly enjoy this process, and while I do find it interesting, overall, in my opinion, all the time and frustration just isn't worth it. That being said, in this particular case, an extra 10 FPS in VR could be the difference between running a game at 72 Hz or 80 Hz, or going from 80 Hz to 90 Hz. So I felt I really needed to give this a try. I started off by opening up the AMD Adrenalin app, clicking on Performance, and then Tuning. Now, the thing other reviewers have stated is that overclocking the VRAM on the 7900 GRE is what makes the biggest difference. So that's where I wanted to start. To help me dial in my overclock, I loaded up the Unigen Superposition Benchmark, which happens to have a VR benchmark built in that I felt would be the perfect tool for this. I first wanted to set our baseline, so I ran the benchmark 5 times to see where the 7900 GRE landed, and I was very surprised to see just how consistent the results were between the 5 benchmark runs. There was only about 1/2 of an FPS difference between the 5 benchmark runs, with all of them landing between 165.1 and 165.5 FPS. Now, I should also mention the CPU I'm running in my test system is the Ryzen 7 9800X3D, which I've paired up with 32 GB of Corsair Dominator Titanium DDR5 6600 CL32 RAM. I have also undervolted my 9800X3D using the curve optimizer in AMD's Ryzen Master software, and have also enabled XMP in the BIOS. And last of all, you probably want to know I have enabled resizable bar. For anyone wanting to know all the specs of my test system, I've listed all the pertinent information in the video description. With the baseline performance established, I then popped over to the AMD Adrenalin app and began overclocking the VRAM. I first added 100 MHz to the memory clock, taking it from the default of 2250 MHz up to 2350 MHz, and then ran the Superposition VR benchmark. A few short minutes later, I had my first result, which didn't seem to really do much of anything. We were still at 165 FPS. I then bumped the memory clock up 50 more megahertz to 2400 and ran the benchmark again, and this time it gave us a nice gain of around 6 FPS to the average frame rate. I then increased the memory clock another 50 megahertz, expecting another noticeable gain, but this time it actually went backwards about 1 FPS. I then tried going up another 50 megahertz, but this went backwards 1 more FPS. I then tried going to plus 300 megahertz from the base memory clock, but we were still at the same 170-ish FPS. I then tried going up 50 more megahertz, but at that point, the 7900 GRE crashed, and I had to reboot my system. I then tried going back to the 300 megahertz overclock I'd previously done, thinking that was my highest stable overclock, but as I went to run the benchmark, the card crashed again. I then dialed it down to 250 megahertz, but again the 7900 GRE crashed. I then downclocked the memory to plus 200 megahertz, where I was finally able to run the benchmark and get a result again. But while just sitting at the desktop, the card would crash. I'm not sure what happened, but after it failed at plus 350 megahertz, any increase I made to the memory clock, even if it was just 50 megahertz, would crash the card. And what made it weird to me was it would seem to be stable while I ran superposition or even a game, but while sitting at the desktop doing nothing, it would crash. At that point, I thought I was going to have to scrap this video altogether. But after doing some research online, I found other people who'd experienced a similar problem, and they found that by increasing the power limit to 115% and undervolting their 7900 GRE by 50 millivolts, they were able to get their card to run stably. I, of course, gave it a try, and thankfully, that did the trick. It did take quite a bit more trial and error after that to get things dialed in, but in the end, I was able to get my card to run stably with a plus 150 megahertz overclock on the memory and plus 140 megahertz on the core. I tried going as high as 2700 megahertz on the core from the stock 2515, but while monitoring the performance during my benchmark runs, my card never went above 2640 megahertz, which is why I settled on 2655 for my setting in the Adrenaline app. I also dialed in a pretty aggressive fan curve to help keep the card cool, because during my benchmark runs, the hotspot on the GPU was reaching 80°C. And while that's a long way from its supposed 110-degree maximum temperature, I've found by keeping the hotspot temp below 80, I was getting the best results. So after hours and hours of tinkering and frustration, I ended up with my overclock netting us about an 8 FPS increase to the average frame rate in the Unigine Superposition VR benchmark over what I got when running the 7900 GRE at stock. This calculates out to a 5% increase to the average frame rate, which was only about half of what I was hoping to achieve. This result was in just a single benchmark though. I thought perhaps things will be different in some actual games, so I went back to my original 7900 GRE VR performance video to see which games the 7900 GRE had performed the worst in, to find out if we could get any kind of improvements with the overclock. In my original video, I was using the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, but since that time, I've upgraded my test PC to the 9800X3D. And there's also been about a year's worth of driver improvements since then, so I ran the 5 worst performing games again, both at stock and with the overclock applied, to see if the overclock would allow us to bump things up just a little bit more. I started with Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, and at stock, the 7900 GRE performed exactly the same as it did in my original video when I was using the 7800 X3D. Just like before, with all the graphical settings at their lowest setting, I was able to set the refresh rate to 72 Hz and the render resolution to 3936 by 2112. I must admit, the Oculus Debug Tool performance overlay isn't really the best for doing this type of comparison, but I buy most of my PC VR games on the Oculus store, and I haven't been able to figure out how to get those games to run smoothly in Steam VR, where I can use FPS VR, which has some much better analytics. If any of you guys know how to get Oculus games to run smoothly in Steam VR, please let me know. Anyway, being limited by the performance overlays available in the Oculus Debug Tool, this side-by-side comparison is the best I can do at the moment. On the left is the game capture from my original video, and on the right is my new stock settings run. And as you can see, looking at the frame rate and the performance headroom graphs, things are more or less in the same ballpark. Now, let's move our new stock settings run to the left and bring in our overclocked run, and as you can see, performance is unchanged. Sadly, our overclock didn't do much of anything for us. I of course didn't give up after that though, and moved on to the next game of my previous 5 worst performers. In my original VR performance video, the 7900 GRE ran Assetto Corsa Competizione at 4128 by 2208 at 90 Hz. And this time around, just like with Flight Simulator, I saw very much the same performance with the 7900 GRE when running at stock. After applying the overclock, like Flight Simulator, when looking at the frame rate and performance headroom graphs, there was no noticeable improvement to the performance. So another disappointing result for our overclock. Next up on the list was Lone Echo 2, and this time I ended up lowering the render resolution to 4224 by 2272 from 4480 by 2400, which is what I used in my original video. While the test runs I made in my original video were able to just barely stay above 90 Hz at that resolution, for whatever reason, I was not able to consistently stay above 90 FPS this time around. The 7900 GRE did do fine through most of my test runs at 4480 by 2400 this time, but there were also moments where the performance headroom ran out and asynchronous space warp would kick in and cut the actual frame rate in half. This is what then prompted me to lower the render resolution one notch, where I was then able to maintain a constant 90 FPS. As you can see here, even with our overclock applied, looking at the performance overhead graph, our results are pretty much identical to what we got when running the 7900 GRE at stock. Being a shooter, the performance headroom in Ghosts of Tabor fluctuates a lot, depending on where you are in a map, what you're looking at, and what you're doing. So I did the best I could to follow the same path and more or less do the same thing each time so we could get as close a comparison of the performance as I could. And as you can see here, when running the 7900 GRE stock and with my overclock, once again, performance was pretty much identical. The last game I tested was Into the Radius, and rather than draw things out any longer, let's cut right to the chase. Based off how things have gone in the previous 4 games, I'm pretty sure you guessed by this point that once again, performance was identical when running the 7900 GRE both at stock and with my overclock. While this wasn't a big surprise to me, seeing as a 5 FPS increase is pretty much within the margin of error when it comes to benchmarking, I was still disappointed that I wasn't able to squeeze more performance out of the 7900 GRE. But at least now, my curiosity, and I hope yours also, has been satisfied. One last thing I want to say before I sign off is that what I was able to get to run stably is a bit lower than what other reviewers I watched here on YouTube were able to achieve. It appears my 7900 GRE is not a Silicon Lottery winner, and it's performing just about at its peak out of the box. But depending on the quality of your GPU, assuming you own a 7900 GRE, you may be able to achieve a better overclock than I was and get enough extra performance where you'll be able to see a difference in the games that you play. Should you feel so inclined, I'd be very interested to hear what kind of overclocks you guys have been able to achieve with your 7900 GREs and how much extra performance it's helped you get. Please share your results in the comments. As for me, this was another overclocking experience that further backed up my past overclocking experiences, that it's not really worth the effort. GPUs nowadays are already being pushed about as far as they can go out of the box. But if you're someone who really enjoys tinkering with this kind of stuff, then by all means, go for it and have fun with it. Come on, do it. You know you want to. Subscribe.